Good morning. I'm Buck McKeon from the 25th District, California, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. These are members of the committee, most of the the chairman of the subcommittees. Each of us will have a few words to say. We have the responsibility to protect our nation's defense and to make sure that those who we send out to war have the things that they need to carry out their missions and return home safely. I have never in my lifetime seen such a lack of leadership and truth-telling emanating from the White House and from our Commander-in-Chief. Senator Reid and the Democratic leadership for 3 years have not passed a budget, and we've given them a pass. You've given them a pass. And I was watching General Odierno this morning. He said he's been Chief of the Army for 1.5 years and never had a budget. That same thing goes for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and all of the chiefs. These men who have dedicated their life to protecting our nation, we put them in these very responsible jobs and give them no financial support, no direction. Sequestration was the president's idea over 1 year ago. And when we tried to fix it, he said, no, if you do anything, I'll veto it. Then during the campaign, he said, it won't happen. Then the last couple of weeks, he's come out and said, it's Armageddon. The world's going to end. And then the last couple of days, he softened it and said, no, it's just kind of going to. He's played all kinds of roles in this position. And when Woodward, a respected journalist, tried to lay out the truth, he was crucified, vilified, and I don't know what extent this White House will go to, but it's got to end. We are done cutting our defense. You know, we are fairly intelligent. We know that we can cut 2 cents out of $1 of government spending. Every family in this nation has had to do that. But while we've cut those 2 cents, 50 cents has come out of our national defense for every dollar we've spent. The president's talked about a balanced approach, and he won't even address what the real problem is. We are telling the president and John Boehner, when you walk out of that meeting this morning, don't plan on cutting our national defense 1 more cent. Now I'd like to turn to Mike Turner.
Thank you, Chairman McKeon. The president has called congressional leaders to the White House as props in the backdrop of his game of sequester, a game that gambles with our national security and hurts our men and women in uniform. Today, the sequester, which the president said and promised the American public would not happen, will happen with a stroke of his pen. This did not need to happen. From the proposal by the president of sequester in August of 2011, through the failure of the super committee, through his reelection campaign until today, the president has not brought forth one proposal to offset or to end sequester. The president has simply not turned in his homework. While the president is touring the country talking about sequester, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and our men and women in uniform are preparing for furloughs to happen across the country, furloughs that will hit people who are protecting our country and protect our national security. And while that is occurring, the only work that's being done on sequester in the White House is being done in the press shop. Yesterday, the Senate took up a bill endorsed by the White House that actually sets off sequester and replaces it with more spending. The CBO scores the bill as a $7.2 billion increase in spending. In other words, the CBO scores the Senate's homework as failing. The House, however, has passed 2 bills. They're both on the House Armed Services Committee website, both of which replace sequester with responsible cuts and both sustain our national security and reduce overall spending. The president's team on sequester has said it's irresponsible, that it's reckless, that it's wrong, that it's dangerous. We agree. In my community at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, over 13,000 people are facing furloughs, and my community is listed as number 3 in the nation that will be impacted by sequestration. Men and women who every day get up and go to work to protect our national security. Today, the president has broken his promise to the American people, and it begins with sequestration that it was his idea, that he places forward today with his signature and does so on the backs of those who protect us. Mr. President, it's time to get to work, time to get behind your desk and send an actual proposal to Congress. Thank you.
I'm Randy Forbes, and I am the chairman of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. People back at our home in Virginia feel there's way too much bravado coming out of the White House and maybe too much coming out of Congress, and nobody's really sitting there and looking at the concerns that they have right now when they're worried about whether or not they can send their children to school, whether they're going to have a job next month or not. And I just want them to know that while the House of Representatives has gone home, the Senate's gone home, chairman of these subcommittees haven't. We're here today, and we're telling you we're continuing to work because we're going to come forward with proposals that help mitigate these consequences for national defense, and we think we'll see them as soon as next week. That's one thing. Second thing is we're tired of the definition we've seen of acceptable risk, and we're going to change that. No longer is it going to be acceptable risk when the United States Navy can only meet 51% of all of our COCOM requirements. No longer is it going to be acceptable risk for our Air Force to have pilots flying planes that are older than them. No longer is it going to be acceptable for us to have an Army that's cutting out 80,000 troops. And no longer is it going to be acceptable for us to find the lowest possible point we can have for our military and still argue that it's acceptable. We are going to begin today a new chapter that rebuilds this military and strengthens it so that it will defend and protect not just our security, but the security of generations that come after us. And the third thing is this: we're turning the lights back on to the analysis for national defense in this country for both political parties. And one of the things that you heard the chairman mention about Bob Woodward, when you have a journalist that starts talking about the actual facts and we find Washington and the White House turning on them and attacking them, the story that hadn't been written is all the gag orders that began with this administration in the Pentagon, where individuals over there could not even talk about the implications of these cuts that have come down. And even as late as last week, I was seeing memorandum where individuals at our shipyards and other places couldn't even talk about these impacts. We're going to change that around and begin writing a new chapter today. And I'd like to present Chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee, Rob Whitman from Virginia.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you, Randy. I want to make sure that people understand where we are today and where we've been. Secretary Gates put in place $100 billion of reduction to our defense budget. In 2011, there were $487 billion of reductions. So as we stand before the sequester, nearly $500 billion, the sequester puts another $500 billion in place on that. By any measure, that for our military is catastrophic. We're at a point where we look at our readiness, our ability to meet the threats that are out there, and just as you've heard, we are at a place of increased risk, at a place of what our military leaders say is a readiness crisis. We cannot be there. We as a nation have always stood behind our military, stood behind our men and women in uniform that defend this nation to make sure that they have the overwhelming superiority on the battlefield when we call on them to defend this nation. That is our obligation as a nation. With this sequester, we will no longer be able to do that. Those men and women, unfortunately, will be asked to go into a fair fight. Fair may be great on the athletic field, but in defense of this nation, it is incomprehensible. We owe it to them. We owe it to the men and women in DOD that serve in the civilian side. We owe it to that great contracting community that supports our military to provide for them the ability to defend this nation, to make sure they have the overwhelming superiority, to make sure they can fight to victory and come home safe. That is our obligation as a nation. That needs to be our renewed sense of urgency as members of the House Armed Services Committee and as a Congress to make sure we do the job that we were sent here to do when we raised our right hand and swore to uphold the Constitution, to make sure we provided for the common defense of this nation and to maintain and provide for its armies and navies. That job needs to start anew today. That's why we are here, folks. Thanks again, and I want to welcome to the podium here the Chairman of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, Chairman Joe Wilson.
Thank you very much for being here today. As a 31-year veteran of the Army National Guard, I want to thank Chairman Buck McKeon for his extraordinary leadership on behalf of a strong national defense. We're here today, as just identified, this is the third round of budget cuts on the Defense Department. Secretary Gates, there was a $100 billion reduction. That was followed by a $487 billion reduction in defense spending. Today begins, ultimately, possibly $600 billion in cuts. The American people need to know these are targeted. The defense budget is, at best, 18% of the federal budget, but 50% of the cuts are applied against defense. This truly does create a circumstance, and I'm very grateful for the leadership Secretary Leon Panetta. He has pointed out that these cuts could lead to the hollowing out of our military, putting our military at risk, putting military families at risk. I appreciate his leadership. Additionally, the American people need to know that our defenses are at a low point. We will have the fewest troops since 1939 in the Army and Marine Corps. We'll have the fewest ships since 1916. We'll have the fewest aircraft since the Air Force was created in 1947. We already see, Gallup has done a survey indicating that the confidence of the American people in our national security is at an all-time low since the questions were first asked in 1993. I'm very hopeful that we can come together on addressing these issues, and I'm so hopeful indeed that the President will change course. We know that the policies of defense that work are peace through strength, and I just hope that he will change his policies and recognize how important we must have peace through strength and not have a circumstance of potential attacks due to weakness. As we're here today, I'm really honored to be here with the chairwoman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Martha Roby of Alabama.
There is a better way to cut spending than slash our military, harm our national security, but most importantly, harming our military families. And from the very beginning for me in August of 2011, that's exactly what this was about, the harm that this sequester, the President's sequester would do to our military families. And I can't help but think about that mom down in Fort Rucker, Alabama, whose husband is on his third or fourth deployment, and she's sitting there watching all of this play out on the news and wondering whether or not she's going to be able to put food on the table for her family, all while her husband is in harm's way fighting for the very freedom and liberty that you and I enjoy. I would just say that it is unconscionable what the President is doing. We cannot tax our way out of the sequester, these automatic cuts, and we can't tax our way out of debt. The President received his tax increase in January. It's time that he and the Senate get serious about mandatory spending reform so we can reprioritize what matters most, and that is providing for a strong national defense. And it is unconscionable for this President to use our military families as pawns in his crusade for higher taxes.
I'm Mac Thornberry from the 13th District of Texas, and let me just close with 2 points. One is that the federal government has to get its fiscal house in order by cutting spending, and the federal government has to defend the country in a dangerous, increasingly complex world. We don't have the luxury of doing one or the other. We have to do both. And there are lots of options to do both. You've heard the House has passed a bill twice that would cut other spending and prevent the sequestration. The McKeon-Ayotte bill would not lay off or furlough anybody. It just reduces federal employment through attrition and use those savings to offset sequestration. I introduced a bill that would just delay further implementation of the health care bill by 2 years. The administration's not going to be ready to do it anyway. 25 states have said they're not going to set up their exchanges. If you just give them more time to get their act together, you save the taxpayers $130 billion, which can also offset sequestration. Point is, there's lots of options out there to do both of those things. We need the Senate and the President to adopt one. Second point is this, we're not giving up. Just because it's March 1st doesn't mean we're folding our hands and saying this is the way it's got to be. For example, next week on the House floor, we're going to vote on a defense appropriation bill that will last through the rest of the fiscal year. Now, that's not going to undo sequestration, but it is going to add flexibility, and it is going to help update the categories, which will reduce some of the damage that comes from having a continuing resolution and a sequestration at the same time. But we're going to keep working for solutions that protect the country, get our fiscal house in order. We need the Commander-in-Chief to do the same.
Thank you all. Thank you again for being here, and now we can take a few questions. Yeah.
Chairman, on the 27th of this month, you're going to be looking at the start of possibly closing down the
The idea of passing just a defense appropriations and a Milcom VA appropriations, as Chairman Rogers would like to do in the House, doesn't sound like it's going to get a lot of traction in the Senate. So are you guys going to push for an omnibus? If at that point, a lot of these bills, from what I've been told, have been negotiated. The committees have been working together. There may be 2 or 3 that there'd be some difficulties, but certainly on defense and a host of other appropriations bills, it looks like you could get deals. Would you push for an omnibus?
Well, as Mac pointed out, it is a CR that will run through the end of the year. Wrapped in that CR is the Defense Appropriation, Milcom, and Veterans Affairs. But it would fund the government through the end of the fiscal year 9/30. You could call it an omnibus, you can call it whatever you want, but it does fix spending for the rest of the year.
So what I'm asking about is the other, would you be willing in a negotiation?
Well,
to get these other-
let's get that passed next week, and then let's see what the Senate does. I mean, we're kind of used to them not doing anything, but we're not waiting till March 27th to work on this. We want to get ahead of it. There's no thought of closing down the government. We've got enough problems around here without getting into that. Yes?
Chairman, you've been raising concerns about this cut, obviously, that it's clearly there are some Republicans, of course, in the last week or so that have indicated that they would be okay with these cuts, at least for the time being. In the context of this broader fight, do you feel there's been a real change on your side of the aisle on this, and does it worry or concern you?
Well, I fought sequestration. I fought the $487 billion, but that's done. We accept that, and the chief said that they could live with that. They had to change the strategy that we've had since World War II. They won't be able to fight 2 wars, protect us in 2 different places around the world. We look at what happens in Korea. We look at Iran. We look at other hot spots around the world. We've pulled back from that. And that's already being implemented, those cuts. But they had a year to work on those and plan. The sequestration gives them no flexibility. It just cuts every department an equal percentage. And it's a crazy way to do things. So I'm hopeful. We knew that defense or the national security spending needed to be part of the deal. What I'm saying, and remember what I said, 50 cents out of every dollar that we've saved so far through this effort has come out of our national security. That's too much when they only account for 18% of the spending. Yes?
Chairman, you said you regret your vote on the budget control act, but given that it's happened now, do you accept any responsibility for sequestration going through?
There's enough blame to go around. Many of these members voted against it. I took the leadership's promise that the super committee would do its work, that it would never happen. The president promised it would never happen. That's passed. It happened. That vote also, at that time, was to raise the debt ceiling. If we hadn't done that, we'd have had a more serious crisis then. I was hopeful that we would, given time, come up with a better solution. Haven't done it. I'm saying it's gone far enough. This is the end. No more cuts out of our national security. Yes?
Mr. Chairman, what would you guys do differently at this point? I know that, the day before that they propounded the idea of the sequestration, that there was a meeting with many of you in the Speaker's office. There have been multiple, plans, proposals, press conferences, news releases, videos that your side has put out to try to inform the public, inform other members about the sequester. What would you have done differently, and how would you have argued differently to avoid this?
Let me turn to Mr. Turner on that.
Part of the problem in all of this debate is the president, at the same time that he made a promise to the American people that it would not happen, he constrained and restricted the Department of Defense of telling the American public what would occur if he broke his promise. Today, we're standing here with the president having broken his promise and the Department of Defense now scrambling to get out to the American public an understanding of what this really means. I think throughout Congress and throughout the Senate and certainly throughout the American public, there is not yet an understanding, because the Department of Defense has not been able to hand in their homework of what will happen, of what this means. We have been working on this, as the chairman has been saying, since it was first proposed by the president. We have a better understanding of the consequences, and this is dangerous, and we agree with the president it's wrong.
Pretty big night of them. And you guys have been talking about this, as far as I remember, almost since
There is no question that the amount of articles that could have been written about the specifics of what this means to educate the American public would have been very helpful while we were speaking words in committee rooms and press conferences. There is a gap between what everyone knows and what's going to happen. We believe that the President has broken his promise. He needs to allow the Department of Defense to now tell people what's going to occur. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, could you explain a little bit more on if you get the defense appropriations bill passed, how it would mitigate the effects of sequestration, maybe some examples of what wouldn't happen and how you can minimize the damage if you get that done?
We have two serious problems. The chiefs in their planning in how they decide to spend their money are handcuffed right now because we're operating under a CR which keeps us on fiscal year 12 financing. We passed a defense authorization bill that ended some programs, that gave them the opportunity to start more important programs. That was passed and signed into law last December. But unless you fund it, they're still kind of hamstrung. And so if we do a CR for the rest of the year or an omnibus or some kind of funding mechanism that doesn't give them the appropriations and the authority to move funds from one area to another, it severely impacts them. One of the gravest concerns we have is readiness. I know that we have troops that are being trained to go to the war theater, and they're not receiving the same training that they did just a year ago because those funds have been cut. And if we do not pass that appropriation bill, they'll be cut further. I was told by the Secretary of the Army that he's going to have to cut 40% out of his operating maintenance account, which is where the training comes from. This cannot be allowed to happen. Yes? You know, in the Congress, there's 435 people. We can't all be experts in everything. We have had the opportunity to hear from the chiefs, those who are on the battle line. We've had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan, to go to Iraq, to go to hot spots around the world and see. We have the greater knowledge of how the impact of these cuts will be on our national security. Most people have forgotten or didn't know about the $487 billion cuts that we've already made. I think most of the American people, when they think of cuts, they're looking at waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, we're past that, way past that. And then when you add the sequestration on top of it, I saw a poll, talk about our megaphone. We have not reached the majority of people. I saw a poll that said a few weeks ago only 38% of Americans knew what sequestration was. And I would guarantee you that out of that 38%, a very, very small portion understand what the real impacts will be. They have not had a chance to visit the bases where this training is not being done that should be done. They have not seen down in Fort Rucker where the flying hours are going to be cut for the helicopter pilots. We know the problem, and we're trying to reach out to all of our colleagues to make sure they understand it too, but that's a process that takes some time. Yes? We just passed $600 billion of cuts, of tax increases just a few weeks ago, and probably many of us voted for that. Did we want it? No. But the president's talked about a balanced approach, and his balanced approach is increase taxes, cut our national security, cut defense. At some point, you have to really, if he wants a balanced approach, he better start bringing mandatory spending to the table, because if we cut all of discretionary spending, we would still be running a deficit of $500 billion a year. Most people understand what the real problem is. It's the mandatory spending. And not bringing that into the discussion makes the rest of this kind of an exercise in futility. Yes.
It sounds like what you guys are talking about is next steps on your side, things to give DOT more flexibility to implement sequestration. Do you plan anything to delay it again or turn it off?
Should we wrap up with the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mac?
That was the second point I tried to make. We're not saying this is done. We're going to keep after it. I gave you 3 different proposals that would save money in other places other than the sequestration, and we're going to keep looking for options. We're not going to say this is done. We have opportunities coming up as budget resolutions come up with the debt ceiling in May. So there's a lot of opportunity to go here. I would say this, as the chairman mentioned, the only area of government spending that has an authorization bill signed into law by the president is defense. So as we're looking at appropriation bills to pass for the rest of the year, passing defense, which is consistent with the authorization bill he's already signed into law, makes perfect sense. We're going to do that next week as a step, but it's not the end. We're going to keep after it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.